Hello, and welcome to this pre-recorded webinar, which is aimed at supporting parents and carers, helping secondary school age young children with managing their fears and worries. My name's Anthony, this is my colleague Dominique, and we are practitioners from Bromley Y, which is a local charity operating in the Bromley area, supporting children, young people and their parents with their emotional well-being. If you'd like to attend one of our live webinars with opportunities to interact, you can sign up to these for free through our Eventbrite page, and the link to sign up is in the description below. So today what we're going to talk about is learning a bit more about anxiety in young people and what this looks like practically for them, considering a range of strategies to support managing fears and worries and building confidence, and to learn more about the services both locally and nationally which can provide further support. So as a starting point, it's important to recognise that our brains aren't fully developed until our early 20s. So your child's brain isn't fully developed just yet. Parts of the brain that manage emotions are in constant flux during the teenage years, and it leaves adolescents more vulnerable to stress and anxiety. The prefrontal cortex, which is this bit right behind our foreheads, the decision-making part of the brain, is responsible for your child's ability to plan and think about the consequences of their actions, to solve problems, control their impulses, is still developing. So instead, teenagers might rely on the amygdala to make decisions and solve problems. The amygdala is the more emotional part of our brain. It's associated with emotions, impulses, aggression, and instinctive behaviours. So this can lead teenagers to be more vulnerable to stress and anxiety, as well as potentially being a little bit more impulsive and engaging in more risk-taking behaviour. There's also a number of other differences within the adolescent brain compared to a fully developed brain, such as the release of melatonin in the adolescent brain, which is a hormone that promotes sleep, is different. That's why your teenagers probably tell you that they're tired all the time. And in studies, the brains of teenagers were found to secrete this melatonin later at around 12 to 1 a.m. So this is hypothesized to be due to changes in the brain due to puberty, pushing this release back later into the day. But arguably, it might also have something to do with increased levels of blue light that teens are exposed to at night time from gaming, mobile phones, Netflix, things like that.
So something we kind of tend to start off with parents is sort of asking them, how do you know that your child is feeling anxious? And if we're lucky, we maybe have the kind of young person or teen who will just flat out tell us. But it's quite often we have to sort of be looking out for those signs and kind of figuring it out. So if they are kind of speaking to you, you might be aware of what their kind of thoughts or worries are. But more obviously for parents, we tend to look at, well, how is the anxiety showing itself sort of physically in their body? You know, we hear quite a lot saying they can actually like see them feeling tenser or kind of hunched up a bit more, kind of physically almost cowering away and protecting themselves. They might complain of things like stomach aches, headaches, which are really, really common ways for anxiety to manifest in the body. And even though we would say typically we see that a lot more at the primary age level, we still know that absolutely can carry on right through teens and adulthood as well. And then the really big one, I guess, for us is their behavior. So what is it they do when they're anxious? Or importantly, what do they not do? Are there things that they're avoiding because of their anxiety? So we will look at some more examples in a moment, thinking about kind of cycles of anxiety, but the most common behaviours we hear from parents they notice in their teens are either kind of withdrawing, spending more time by themselves, kind of not going out and doing things as much with their friends, or kind of almost reassurance seeking, and kind of attaching themselves to parents a lot more, or to other friends, and feeling like they can't do things by themselves. And then avoidance might be really obvious. So it might be, you know, they avoid going to parties because they feel like it's too overwhelming for them and too anxiety provoking, so they just don't go. But avoidance can also be a little bit more subtle. And it can be around things like, you know, finding reasons to, you know, not answer the door if that's something that makes them anxious, or yeah, kind of doing things they feel like makes them safe. So sort of like safety behaviours, which again we'll mention a little bit more. So just take a moment to really think about, for your young person, how do you know if and when they're feeling anxious? Are there things that you notice about their behaviour that changes in certain moments or over a longer period of time if anxiety has been building up? Do they have any of those kind of physical complaints that they would share, or can you just physically see it in their body and they change? Or are you aware of what their thoughts and worries are? One of our kind of key starting points, one to explain to parents, but also when we work with young people, is to really help them understand what anxiety is and why we experience it, to try and take a little bit of the mystery out of it, because it can be really scary, especially if we are having a lot of those physical symptoms and what we kind of think of as like the panic side of anxiety. So the more we know about it and the more we help young people understand it, the more prepared we can all feel to sort of help that and de-escalate it as soon as possible. So we kind of start with, well, we experience anxiety because at one point we needed it to survive. So our kind of ancestors, kind of cave people time, were faced with lots of kind of predators and dangers in the world. And so anxiety was something that could kick in with what we call the fight, flight, freeze response, to kind of get our bodies ready for action. And so this is linked to our sympathetic nervous system that activates this response. So we've kind of got the fight response. You might be seeing more aggression, more irritable, more kind of snappy. The flight response is that kind of, I need to get out of here. We can also think about that as some of the avoidance, just like, I'm not going to go there, there's a danger. And then freeze response, you know, would have traditionally been that kind of, you know, play dead. It's almost that sense of, this is too much, I can't cope, I'm going to kind of shut down. So those kids, you know, they might say they're sort of scared stiff, or just really feel like they can't move. They're just completely shut down, really overwhelmed, withdrawal as well. So we really talk to young people about this fight, flight, freeze response and get them to think about how it impacts them, and explain that it's basically a false alarm. Our situation has changed, in that we're hopefully not fighting predators every day or trying to run away from them, but our brain still is on the lookout for danger. And today that might be things like, you know, busy places. It might be things like putting our hands up in class, a whole wide range of things that might trigger this anxiety. And our body is still producing hormones like adrenaline and cortisol that activate this response and cause those physical symptoms like our heart beating faster, breathing quicker, and maybe some sweaty palms, changes to digestion and stomach, all to help prepare our body to do this response. But because there's no physical danger and we normally can't fight it off or run it off, that it just builds up into this panic and feels horrible. So something I say quite a lot is that anxiety is like the smoke alarm going off when you've burnt the toast. It's reacting like there's danger, but actually when we look a little bit closer, it's not quite true. So helping them understand that it feels uncomfortable, maybe even horrible and scary, but it doesn't mean there's anything wrong and that it is going to pass by itself. So anxiety is something that's built into all of our brains. We all experience it at some point in some different ways. And we know that kind of adolescence can be a particularly anxiety provoking time for teens in terms of the changes that are happening in their bodies, changes with their friends, pressure at school, whole range of things. So how do we know if it's a problem, if it's something that everyone experiences? So something we would encourage parents to think about is, well, when did the symptoms first start? So when did you first start to notice them, or that they started reporting them? And if it's in response to a time that we typically would see some anxiety, for example, school transition or exams, or I know we definitely saw a massive increase of anxiety around the start of COVID last year, we have to see that as a natural response. It's kind of something we have to work through and go through. It's normal to be anxious. And actually, for some things, it can be helpful and protect us. So, for example, a little bit of anxiety might help us feel motivated to get prepared and more organized for exams and kind of revise a bit more. Anxiety might have helped us, make sure that we were washing our hands thoroughly at the start of the pandemic. So is it a natural response to what's going on in their life? Is it just something they need a bit of time to work through? What is the kind of impact for your child? So impact is kind of thinking of, is it stopping them from doing what they want to be doing or what they should or could be doing? Sometimes we're anxious about things that aren't going to impact our life, because if we avoid them, it's not a big deal. There might be things like, oh, I'm afraid of roller coasters, they make me anxious. Not going on roller coasters is not a big deal. It might start to get to them if their friends are going to theme parks all the time, but by and large, it's not part of everyday life. But if it's something that is making them anxious is part of their everyday life, it can have a massive impact. It can impact their social life, it can impact how they're doing at school, and it can begin to sort of grind down on their mood a little bit as well if they feel like they're having to make their world a bit smaller because of anxiety. Other thing we want to think about really is what's the impact for you. So it's not just how it's impacting them, but we know that anxiety in teens can start to have an impact on that wider system. And it might find that the whole family are maybe having to do things a certain way to accommodate anxiety and avoidance. You might be finding more of your time giving reassurance. And it can just add to the stress of being a parent with more stuff to think about. So if you've noticed anxiety in your teen and you're thinking, well, the symptoms maybe started at a time that there didn't seem to be any particular trigger. It's been going on for a while. It's not sort of resolved itself, and it's impacting them in some way and starting to impact me. That's when we might be thinking, okay, can we get some extra support for this? Maybe this is hitting problematic anxiety.
So Dominique's just explained what anxiety is and when it might be problem anxiety. So when trying to understand anxiety on a more individual level, so for your child, it can be helpful to break it down into three components: our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviours, which are all linked. So our thoughts create feelings within us. Our feelings, which are both our emotional feelings, but also physical sensations going on in our body, then force us to behave in a certain way in response to those feelings. And often our behaviour can reinforce our initial anxious thoughts. So now we're going to look at an applied example of this vicious cycle. So here you can see how this vicious cycle of anxiety between the components works and how it actually maintains the feeling of anxiety. So our thoughts when we're anxious, we appraise situations and events for any anticipated risk, and we overestimate the danger of something bad happening, and we underestimate our ability to cope with that danger. So for example, thinking, I'm going to fail the exam, I don't know any of the answers, I'm not going to pass my GCSEs, would be overestimating the danger and underestimating how we'll cope with it. This then kicks in some feelings. It makes us feel anxious, makes us feel worried, makes us feel panicked or stressed. And once we feel anxious, that's when that fight, flight, freeze response that Dominique spoke about kicks in, and we notice a whole host of physical sensations because of adrenaline coursing through our bodies. So we might notice that we're starting to have headaches or stomach aches. We might notice our heart's racing or our breathing becoming a little bit faster or shakier. And as a result of these feelings, we participate in certain behaviours because we feel uncomfortable and we want to get rid of that feeling. So when we're talking about anxious behaviour, that's behaviour aimed at helping you to anticipate and or avoid future danger. So that includes avoidance, which Dominique touched on earlier, so not doing the thing that is making us feel anxious, which in the short term feels great, brings our anxiety levels right down. But in the long term, it means that we never learn that we could have actually coped with that scary situation. And so it reinforces our anxious thought that we can't cope. Safety behaviours are things that we do with the intention to keep ourselves safe. So for example, on a hot day, we might carry a bottle of water with us when we're on the train to manage our anxious thought that we're going to pass out because it's so hot and crowded. And again, this prevents our ability to learn that we actually could have coped without that bottle of water. That bottle of water isn't magically stopping us from passing out. Often with children and young people, they'll seek a lot of reassurance, especially from yourselves as parents and carers. So when we're talking about reassurance seeking, we really mean excessively asking others questions to relieve your own anxiety. So it's really common when there's some uncertainty in a situation, especially, past couple of years with COVID have been very uncertain, asking a lot of questions like, are you sure everything will be okay? Are you sure that everyone's going to be all right? Also, what if I have failed the test? Or do you think my friend is upset or mad with me? So what they're doing there is they're looking for someone to take the doubts and worries away for them rather than tackling it and managing it themselves. And another form of anxious behaviour, the last one I'm going to talk about before we move on to a case study, is perfectionism or procrastination. So we see this a lot in relation to anxiety around exams with young people. So the perfectionism side of it is an attempt to overcompensate for the anxiety, but it actually keeps our anxious thoughts going because we never feel satisfied or quite good enough. We're overworking. And procrastination could be viewed as a type of avoidance. We reduce our anxiety in the short term, but longer term we're maintaining the anxiety because the thoughts about how dangerous or scary the exam is get worse and worse the closer the exam comes, and our lack of ability to cope with it, our perceived lack of ability to cope with it rather, also gets worse. So sometimes this cycle means that others unwittingly get pulled into the cycle, and a lot of the time with young people, those others are their parents and carers, because as parents we're hardwired to protect our children. So we don't like it when they don't feel at their best. We don't want them to be having the stomach aches or to be feeling stressed, and we want to protect them. So we can find ourselves giving this reassurance a lot of the time, or maybe letting them avoid the thing that they don't like doing, or being cautious, letting them do new things because you're worried that they might not cope with it because you know that they do get anxious. And we might be really aware of our child struggling in certain situations, which can raise our own anxiety, which children pick up on. They're aware when we're anxious. Sometimes we think we're doing a great job of hiding it, but children are like sponges. They pick up on all the feelings and everything around them, and sometimes that can keep the anxiety going as well. So we're going to look at a quick case study of John, who is 15 years old, and we're going to go through what's going on for him and then think a little bit about what the things maybe that are maintaining John's anxiety. So John was on the bus and he noticed a couple started fighting while he was on the bus, and he felt panicked and worried that he'd be hurt or the bus would have to stop and he'd be late. He felt tearful, he no longer wanted to get the bus to school, so Dad started driving him to school. And then he started to feel anxious when walking anywhere alone and needed company even for short local walks. So Mum decided to buy him some herbal remedies for him to take in the mornings to calm him down, and his parents are regularly telling him, look, it's okay, John, nothing bad is going to happen. But nothing that they've tried seems to have helped, and the parents are increasingly worried about his lack of confidence. So with parents unsure of how to help him, they speak to school about maybe letting John just take a few days off school to relax and reset. So considering that vicious cycle that we've just spoken about, what might be keeping John's anxiety going, and what might be helpful for him, both short term and long term. So some of the possible maintaining factors in this case study are, I think there's some anxious thinking going on for John. He's overestimating the danger of being on the bus. He's underestimating how well he'll cope if something does happen while he's on the bus. And that has led to some avoidance. He's just completely shut down the idea of getting the bus. And his parents have accommodated this avoidance because they don't like seeing him upset. So Dad said, all right, I'll give you a lift to school. So John's not having any experiences to further test whether or not his anxious thinking is correct. And that's keeping the worry going. He's engaged in some safety behaviours as well. So his parents are walking with him when he pops down to the corner shop. He's taking the herbal remedies, which he thinks he needs to take now because of his anxiety. And I just want to make clear, we're not discouraging the use of herbal remedies, but just in this specific case example, sometimes they can be used as a safety behaviour or maybe a bit of a crutch. So people become a bit reliant on them to cope each morning. John's also getting a lot of reassurance from his parents, which in the short term relieves that anxiety, but in the long term kind of reinforces his belief that there is something to be worried about because his parents are giving it the time of day. And it seems a bit as though his parents are a bit anxious about what's going on. They're maybe lacking a bit of confidence knowing how to deal with this brand new situation. How does that come across to John? You know, when a child's feeling anxious, it can make their parents feel less confident because things do feel out of control, and that's a perfectly natural response. And as parents, it's important to try and remain in control, try and create feelings of safety and confidence in your children by being boundaried and maybe sort of containing them a little bit, not letting these worries get out of control. So this doesn't mean that you can't be compassionate and empathetic to your child's worries, but for example, resorting to taking time off school to reduce the stress, again, it will probably help in the short term, but long term, it will make things more difficult and it will make John think there's a reason to be worried.
Yeah, and I think when we do this case study in the live webinars, we get some really interesting discussions out of it, because I think it's something we see so much of parents doing their absolute best and thinking that, you know what, they need a bit of time to kind of recuperate and just, you know, to be able to work through that. But what can happen then is that they've got the message of, well, I don't have to do that, and it is dangerous, I can't cope with it, and it can just become that stuck pattern really quickly. So what was started off as a short-term solution then becomes the long-term problem. And I'm just saying that as well because it can happen quite quickly without us, with the best intentions, and there's no judgment or shame or anything, you know, for these parents, because they've done the most normal thing. They've tried to protect their child and handle it the best they can. So just being really aware with things like that it has to be a short-term solution, and being clear with your child if that you feel like they do need that break and helping them get back into it. So this kind of leads us into the section on, well, what can help? So we're going to start talking about some of our strategies and tips. And you might have things that you're already doing that you find really support your child, which is fantastic. And I've heard, again, so many great tips from parents at this point of the webinar, and when we are having an interactive one. So I really just want to use this chance to say that if you're doing something that works, keep doing it. You know, what we're going to talk about now are just some additional suggestions of things that we know have helped other parents manage that anxiety in their teens. And we know as well that not what works for one doesn't always work for the other, and it sometimes can be a bit of a trial and error with some of these strategies. So because we've been talking already about how anxiety can be broken down into those thoughts and sort of feelings and physical sensations, and then the behaviors, we're going to talk about the strategies for each part of that cycle. because it is a cycle. So if we're able to change at least one part of it, we have an opportunity of helping them break out of it and change that whole system. So we will start off with our thoughts. So before we kind of get into challenging thoughts, we want to think a little bit about containment, which Ant has already mentioned. And a way to do this is just to have a bit of a reflection on this little mini scenario. So if you imagine that your child came home from school and told you that they have not done as well as they wanted to on a test. They share their worry that they will not pass their end of year exams and they're not going to achieve anything in the future and start becoming tearful. So I think this is something that quite a lot of us will have had some experience of, and this is what we kind of call that catastrophizing, that one test doesn't go well and it can escalate quite quickly to, well, all my exams are going to go wrong, and then I won't be able to go on to college, and then I won't be able to do what I want to do. It can escalate very quickly. And what we want to really think about is, well, what is a containing way to respond? Because there's a chance that sometimes with our conversations of being potentially dismissive while trying to reassure them, and because we know that teens don't always take things the way that we perhaps mean them. And yeah, what might actually escalate this? So, if you've had that moment where you've said something that you thought was really reassuring and sensible, and they've been like, oh, no one listens to me, you don't understand. And this is something that containment can help with. So when we talk about containment, we think about these kind of key things. So what might initially be our response is that kind of, oh, well, I'm sure it wasn't as bad as you thought, or, I believe in you, as long as you just do your best. Really lovely things that sometimes some young people just don't want to hear. So our suggestion is just to really listen to this and really empathize with them. Oh, I'm sorry to hear you've not done as well as you've wanted. I know that that's really difficult for you. Just really labeling what they're feeling and just showing them that you recognize it. You want to really validate them and make them feel like their worry is important. And I think in this example, that's quite straightforward. But, sometimes our young people will come to us with things that we just feel are so silly and not a problem. But actually, if we can just take a moment to really put ourselves back in their shoes and validate that, it can sometimes get us a little bit further with that conversation. So just thinking, it makes sense that you are upset about that. I know that school's important to you and that you want to do well. Lots of young people are working on this as well, which leads us into that normalizing. They're not going to be the only one who felt that way. So kind of asking, did other people find the test hard? I think everyone's had moments where they feel like they haven't done as well as they wanted to. Just using it that kind of empathize, validate, normalize. And if they're kind of outpouring more worries, I'd say throw in a summarize as well, just to show them that you are really listening and understanding. And then this last one, think about solutions together, can be quite important, because what we often want to do is jump in and be like, well, you're just gonna have to work harder next time, or you're gonna have to almost want to tell them what they can do to be helpful. But if we're able just to pause and work through that together and ask them, well, what can we do about this? How could you be better prepared next time? What might you find helpful? One, to include them in that conversation so they really do feel like they have your attention or being heard, but you're also showing them that you have faith in them to kind of be able to sort out some of their own problems and help get their brain out of that negative cycle and into thinking about some practical things they can do. And this might sound quite simple, but I think sometimes it really does take practice. When I talk about containment with parents, they're like, yeah, no problem. They kind of go away and come back. I'm like, I actually found it quite strange to have to sort of shift that gear a little bit and fight what we call the righting reflex, wanting to make things right. So some other little tips to help you with this, or to think about when you were a teen, what were the times that you really felt heard and understood by your parents, carers, or other trusted adults? What were the responses that you actually found helpful from those around you? So just thinking about, when are those times that you can contain the worry and just listen? You don't need to give answers or solutions or help them challenge it. You can actually just listen, validate and normalize, and give them a chance to think about what they might find helpful. Another one that can be really helpful to help them sort through it, especially if they've got lots of worries and they're coming at me lots of things, is to think, well, is this a worry or is it a problem? and just help them split those two things out. And the way that we separate those generally is by thinking that a worry tends to be those hypotheticals, those what ifs. What if this happens? What if that happens? Whereas a problem tends to be something that we can do something about. It tends to be quite practical. And so why this can be helpful is that, one, we're sorting out what are actually worries and problems. We get that list down a little bit so it feels less overwhelming. But also it gives us an opportunity to teach our young people that worrying is just a bad habit. Sometimes it feels really important, and that if we're able to worry, we're preparing ourselves somehow. But the outcome never depends on how much we worry about it. All we're doing is dragging up those negative thoughts and feelings ahead of time. So you can use a flowchart like this, or you can just do it with some simple questions to go, what actually are we worried about? Is there something we can do about it? If the answer is no, it is a worry. And the best thing we can do is try to distract ourselves and move on. And that takes a lot of practice, especially if you have a natural worrier. Our brain will default to that mode quite a lot. But just really encourage them that they don't have to worry about it until it kind of presents itself as a problem. Just modeling a little bit of that acceptance again, of maybe uncertainty or coping with anxiety, and that sometimes it just pops up for no reason. If there is something you can do about it, thinking about those solutions together, what can you do, or how could you find out what to do? And sometimes making lots of lists with lots of different ideas can help children feel really contained as well, to go, actually, I've got a few different options of how to handle this. Then we go, well, can I do this right now? And if you can, do it. And if you can't, plan when you're going to, and then tell yourself to stop worrying and try and distract it. So as long as you've had that conversation where you really have a chance to talk about the worry and think about it, then sort it into a worry or problem, we're sending that clear message that you don't need to think about it, because worrying is not helpful. It's just another bad habit. If the worry is something they're really struggling to kind of let go of, or it's coming up a lot, something that could be helpful is to start gently challenging it. And again, instead of kind of telling them, what we want to do is sort of ask them, encouraging them to get them to think about it for themselves. Because as I'm sure most of you will know, the teenagers don't always want to hear what we have to say, or don't always want to believe us. It can be in one ear and out the other. Whereas if we get them to think about it for themselves, it can help them start to shift some of those perspectives, think about it a little bit more. It might feel more meaningful to them. And as well, it's giving them some questions that they can ask themselves in the future, and therefore kind of improve that coping capacity. So we've got kind of some starter phrases on the screen that, we'll quite often say in response to hearing from young people's worries. And so just taking a second to think about, well, how can I turn that into a question instead? So, if they're telling you about something, look, the very worst thing that could happen is, da, 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 da. It's getting them to tell you it and not shying away from it, to go, well, and if that is the worst thing that could happen, how would you cope with it? So, worst thing that might happen. What is it about this situation that is making you worried? Sometimes they'll really struggle with that. So be prepared to kind of give them some time. And if they're really struggling to get there, you can offer a couple of suggestions. Some young people would be worried about X, Y, Z. Is that the same for you? So still giving it as an open question, but giving them some prompt options. And what is it that's frightening you? What else might happen is a great one, getting their brain to start thinking about alternatives to their anxious scenario or their worst case scenario. And one that I find that young people often forget is nothing. If they're worried about something bad happening, is actually going, well, nothing might happen. Sometimes that's when I do prompt them on. How would you cope if that did happen? Because we know that there are no guarantees that their worst case scenarios are not going to happen, no matter how unlikely that we might think that they are. And getting them to think, well, if it did happen, how would you cope? What could you do with that? Again, bringing in a little bit more of that problem solving ahead of time. How many times has it happened before? This can be helpful if they think something's really, really likely, but actually we know that it's unlikely, getting them to think about their evidence for it. And this is one of my favorites. What would you tell a friend if they had the same thought? And this one's good because in general, it's much easier to kind of give advice to other people that we don't necessarily think of for ourselves. And often really good advice I get from young people. And when I ask, well, why can't you apply that to yourself? There's always some sort of excuse or reason that it's different. And I do think part of that is that it's easier to be kinder and calmer for others. So, what would you tell a friend if they were having this worry, if they were having this thought, and getting them to have those kind words and ask them, well, how can you apply that to yourself? So just a couple of little open questions, being curious and helping them explore their worry. Sometimes we talk about it being like a little bit of a detective, trying to unpick it and figure out what it is that's going on for them and encourage that perspective shift.
Yeah, and using those kind of questions in our work, we find it's alarming how often our ideas are wrong. So it's really important to use those questions, because if we're going down one route thinking they're, worried about going to school because they're really stressed out with the workload, but in fact they're worried about going to school because they're being bullied, very different strategies that we would use to counter that. And the only way to find that out is to start asking those open questions and stop assuming that we know.
Yeah, and sometimes actually just, I think parents can be so easily discouraged when they don't know or don't want to talk about it. And actually to say, don't give up. Sometimes you have to really pick your moment. You might have a young person who really wants to have that sort of sit down one-on-one time to have a chat about it and feel really attended to. Others, that just feels like too much. It's almost like that, no, leave me alone. And actually asking a couple of those questions when you're doing something else together or doing an activity or out for a walk or something like that can take some of that pressure off and give them that bit of space as well. So, being patient and not being afraid to kind of come back to it can be helpful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking back to that cycle of thoughts, feelings and behaviours, we're now going to look at how we can address patterns of anxious behaviour. So anxiety won't go away unless your child or young person faces their fears and gathers new information about their anxious expectations, so whether or not they are true. If they always avoid or run from anxiety-provoking situations, they'll never find out what actually happened, whether that was as bad as they thought or whether they could actually cope with it. So they need to face their fears in order to overcome them. So this can be done in a few different ways. The first is an accidental experiment. So you find yourself in a situation where your child has accidentally forgotten something that they usually rely on to feel safe. So for example, that bottle of water on the tube that they like because it makes them feel safe. And unexpectedly, they found themselves in a situation where they have to try and cope without it, and they have to give it a go, and they have to see how that felt and how they got through it. The next step, the next approach would be a planned experiment. So this is helping your child to do an experiment to see if their worries are accurate. So if there's something that they're always worried about, this can be really helpful. And you can work with them to make a prediction about, okay, what do you think is going to happen in this situation? Then test it out. And then afterwards review what actually happened. So for example, with the world starting to open back up again after COVID, at time of recording, that might have changed now. A lot of people are quite anxious about going back into shops or restaurants. So if that's your child, asking them to go up to the worker in the shop and see what happens when you ask where something is and see if it's what you thought would happen. And then the next stage would be, if this is quite a deeply ingrained fear or anxiety, something that seems like it'd be too much throwing them in the deep end to try it all out in one go, we break it down into a facing fears ladder. So for example, if your child is anxious about returning to school after half term, you can step by step build that up. So towards the end of the holidays, you could be just getting in the car and driving past the school with them. You could then move that to, okay, you get the bus to school, so let's do that bus route, I'll do it with you, and getting on the bus with them and again going past the school. Then to getting off the bus, at the correct bus stop for the school, then to walking into the school, and so on and so forth until they're actually doing it on their own and going to school. And when doing this, it's really important to include your child in making the ladder. So getting them to identify the steps, and for each step saying how anxious it would make them feel and what they think would happen around that. So a good place to start is by starting with, okay, what would be a 10 out of 10? What's the thing that would make you most anxious in the world? For me, I absolutely hate heights, and I know Dominique has a very similar response to this to
Yeah.
I do. The idea of skydiving, I just
Ugh.
don't stand it at all, and I don't think I would get out of the plane. That's a 10 out of 10. I think I would
I wouldn't
just
get in the
shut
plane.
down. Yeah, I think I would shut down and I would completely freeze. So that's my 10 out of 10. So work out for your child what's their 10 out of 10, because then it makes it a lot easier to score the other things on their ladder appropriately. And asking them, right, where are you comfortable starting this?
Mm.
And all the way along, it's really important to praise bravery and praise giving it a go. So it might be that they want to go up to the next step and it's just too hard and they can't quite complete that step. That doesn't mean that the whole process has been a failure. You know, it's important throughout all of these ways of learning, especially sort of the facing fears ladder, I think, that we recognize how difficult it is to face our fears and let our children know that and reinforce that knowledge through lots of praise, lots of encouragement. If it's something specific and something really challenging, kind of a reward afterwards for giving it a go, so that when things don't go so well, they don't just straight away give up, because it's normal for things not to go to plan sometimes. So rethinking with your child, all right, what was difficult about that? Why didn't it quite work? And what could we do to make it a little bit easier next time? And it might be that you need to go down a step and just consolidate that for a little while. So another thing that's really important for sort of managing anxious behaviours is having a balance of activities. Our mood can be hugely affected by what we do, when we do it, who we do it with, and in order to maintain a healthy sense of well-being, we need a balance in what we do. So we use the acronym ACE to help us remember that we want a balance of things that give us a sense of achievement, so work, studying, even doing chores, things that help us connect with others, so be that hanging out with your friends or having, you know, a nice family dinner or doing something out in the community, going to scouts or whatever it is that you do, something that helps you connect with others. And enjoyment is so important and something that we often forget. We really need to find time to mess about, have fun, give ourselves that sense of enjoyment, things that make us happy. And when we feel really stressed, we often spend a lot more time in the achievement section, and then we miss out on some of the enjoyment, some of the connection to others. And then when we feel low, we withdraw and we isolate and we do less. And when we feel anxious, we tend to avoid places or people that are kind of in those environments that make us feel anxious. And this balance can just get out of whack. So it's important that young people have time for themselves every day, through relaxation, through fun and enjoyment, and they get a healthy balance of, yeah, doing all the things they need to do to get that sense of achievement, but also being able to switch off sometimes and being able to connect with others. And doing these activities affects the chemistry in our brain, so the chemicals that our brain fires off, by acting directly on the release of neurotransmitters. And this is our doing things we enjoy is our natural antidepressant, our natural anti-stress medication. Achievement stimulates the chemical dopamine in our body. Doing things with purpose stimulates serotonin. Connecting with others stimulates oxytocin, which is what's known as the love hormone. and so does chocolate. Fun fact for you there. And exercise stimulates a load of endorphins in our body, which, as we all know from experience, we feel better after we've gone for that run that we've been putting off. So making sure that we keep these ACE activities going every day can help us maintain a positive sense of well-being. So another thing that can be really stressful for children and young people, especially around exam time or around all the various things that have been going on with COVID and lockdowns, is tolerating uncertainty. We know that the past couple of years have been difficult for everybody, and a lot of parents tell us that they're unsure how to respond to their child when they ask questions about being uncertain. So as humans, we want certainty, we like certainty. It makes us feel safe, it allows us to predict things and plan things, and we're always striving for certainty. But we don't always have certainty. And we think of uncertainty as being a bit like spicy food. Everyone can tolerate different levels of uncertainty in the same way everyone can handle different levels of spice. Some people can have a vindaloo at lunchtime and then go back to work and just get on with their day. Some people won't even touch a korma because they just can't hack it. And there's no right or wrong with that, just the same as there's no right or wrong with how much uncertainty you can tolerate. It's just worth considering how much uncertainty your child can tolerate, because if there's someone who typically can tolerate lower levels of uncertainty, then there's someone who might exhibit higher levels of worry and higher levels of reassurance seeking. And at the moment, everyone's uncertainty levels are that bit higher, so they might be able to tolerate a bit less than they usually would. So there's no right or wrong way to respond to this uncertainty, but we want to discuss some tips for responding to children's worries around uncertainty, and also with a bit of a COVID slant on things, because there's been so much COVID uncertainty. We get a lot of questions about that. So the first one, and a big one, is modelling acceptance of uncertainty, normalising how difficult it can feel when things are out of our control, and demonstrating to your child that whatever the situation is, it is out of their control, and it's okay to feel a little bit uncomfortable with that. You know, normalising for your children, letting them know that, yeah, it's normal to worry about the things that we can't control. It's normal to want control to make us feel safe, but embracing the idea that we can't control everything, and let's try, easier said than done, but let's try and focus on the things that are in our control. And some things can really help us to stay in the moment with things like that, enjoying a nice walk, dinner, whatever it is that helps us to relax and get back to the moment. Another one is just be honest, you know, stick to the facts. If you don't know the answer to your child's question, don't give them an answer that isn't true. You know, let them know, you know what, I don't know what the answer is to that. And it's modeling again for them that it's okay not to know all the time. And especially with, I know I keep talking about it, but COVID regulations constantly changing. If you've lost track of it and you're not sure, then by all means say, you know what, I don't know. Let's look this up together. Let's Google it together and work it out. It's okay not to have all the answers. Another one is just be mindful of external triggers. You know, we have some young people who are really worried about bigger global things, not just things that affect them. So some people who are really impacted by the idea of poverty, or the idea of natural disasters, even things that don't directly affect them. And we're not saying, you know, go and live in a cabin in the woods and switch off the news and turn off your phones, but also it's okay to turn off your BBC News notifications. It's okay to not watch the news every single day. If that is going to trigger something, you can take some time out from it. It doesn't mean that it's any less important or you're taking it any less seriously. And then last but certainly not least in this is just being aware of your own emotions. As we mentioned earlier, children are really sensitive to the emotions of those around them. And it's helpful to think about how we manage our own anxieties when we're responding to their worries. Dominique mentioned earlier containment and escalation, and sometimes we go into fix it mode and we just want to help. And you know what? A lot of the time that's really helpful, but sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming. So it can be as simple as just taking a breath or having a sip of water when your child comes to you, to gather your thoughts before you actually answer them, to give yourself a chance to think, okay, am I responding to this with my anxiety, or am I responding to their question directly?
So we've thought now about how to kind of address and explore kind of anxious thoughts. We've thought about how we can actually change some of those behaviours, both encouraging them to do more through the kind of facing fears and experiments, as well as maybe some of our own behaviours around modelling uncertainty. So the last kind of thing we want to think about are those bodily sensations, those feelings, how your young person can cope and manage any of those physical responses from the fight, flight, freeze. So our first line of defense is always to explain to them what it is that's happening. So as I was saying earlier, really making sure they understand what anxiety is, where it's coming from, and the different responses they might have, and how that shows to them. Because what we know is that actually sometimes in that cycle, and once we start noticing and experiencing those physical symptoms like our heart beating or our stomach turning or feeling sick, is that we then start to worry about them and feel like, oh my goodness, you know, I'm going to pass out, I'm going to faint, which, fun fact, it is nearly medically impossible to faint when you're feeling anxious, because fainting is to do with a massive drop in blood pressure, whereas when you're anxious, your blood pressure is too high to do that. So if that is something that your young person is worried about, feel free to share that fact. But yeah, they're going to need to sit down, I'm going to pass out, everyone's going to notice that I'm panicking. We have lots of additional worry thoughts about what we're physically feeling. So the more that we understand it, and the more we can name it and label it and just think, I know what this is anxiety, pardon me, this is part of my fight, flight, freeze response. They'll be sending calming messages to their brain, telling themselves that this feels uncomfortable, but this will pass. All of that is going to try to start slowing it down and de-escalating some of that situation, because they're not going to be freaking out about how they feel in their body. Really encouraging them to kind of stop and take a break. You know, sometimes we can get really into, I've just got to push through this mode. And sometimes we just need a little bit of a reset. You know, it's okay to go away and try again. And that's the same for those experiments as well as kind of everyday situations if we're feeling a bit overwhelmed. Even just taking a couple of minutes, you know, a break, go get a drink, go and you know, have a quick chat, or just kind of clear your head a little bit. Deep breathing is one that I'm sure everyone has heard of and have lots of different opinions on. But what we do know is if we are able to do some deep breathing successfully, is that it activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the kind of rest and digest to the sympathetic nervous system's fight, flight, freeze. And it's really about finding a technique that works for your young person. You know, I think I find the counting ones really difficult. I lose track. I find it quite exhausting. And so there are loads of kind of visualizations they can follow. A really simple one is to kind of think of box breathing. So they can either trace a box with their finger, or they can kind of find a square or any kind of four-sided shape in the room and just trace it with their eyes. And as they're going across, they breathe in, hold, breathing out, and then hold. Something quite soothing about it. I'm really encouraging them to take a deepest breath as possible, you know, get them to put their hand on their stomach and really notice what happens, that kind of rise of the chest, and they're really filling their lungs, and encouraging them to breathe out as slowly and as controlled as they can, which really just forces everything to slow down. And practicing that for a few minutes a day, even when we feel fine, we can start to feel the benefits of feeling more relaxed. And it also means that we're more likely to use it when we are feeling anxious or starting to panic, because we've practiced it and we can feel the difference when actually we're doing it at quite a chill time. So that's what I really recommend, having a go at and starting to practice and find the right technique for you or your young person, maybe even at bedtime. It can be nice to do. Grounding techniques are anything that kind of just bring us back to the present moment. We know that anxiety has a lot to do with worries and the what ifs and thinking about what's going to happen next. Sometimes you might be kind of ruminating on things that already happened. Why did I have to say that? Why did I have to go? Grounding brings us back to the present moment using our senses. So a really popular one is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so when we ask people to name 5 things that they can see around them, we ask them to listen for 4 things that they can hear. And that's quite good if we're in a quiet room as well, because you sometimes to really listen and start tuning into sounds you hadn't previously noticed. 3 things you can touch, and you kind of get them to reach out and actually touch them, even if that's just, their hands, things on their person. 2 things we can smell. Again, I often get the air, but again, it can just be things really close to them. If there is something they can spray to have a little smell of, that's nice. And 1 thing that we can taste. So that might be kind of the last thing they ate or drank. If they have a mint, they can pop it in and really focus on the taste of that. But if there really is nothing, I encourage just to have a quick scan, kind of mental scan of your body, and think of 1 sensation somewhere in your body. That's called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding. They can also do things that just get their brain using up cognitive capacity elsewhere. So, counting backwards from 104s, and they might want to try and spell their name backwards and family name backwards. They can start making lists in their head. So they might think, okay, movies start with go through the alphabet starting with A, so movies beginning with A, movies beginning with B. Just something that's going to use up some of that brain power that's being spent on worries or focusing on physical sensations, and get it elsewhere. But really that key thing is around, again, relating back to the education around fight, flight, freeze response and anxiety, is that it's just a feeling. It cannot hurt them, and it will pass. It will go away. And I encourage them to think about what has happened those times. Maybe they have got out of the situation, avoided it, and the panic went down, and explaining that it would have went down by itself anyway. Ask them to think about times that they had felt anxious, did it anyway, and what happened. So good examples tend to be before performances of some sort, or doing readings, having to go somewhere new, and encouraging them to think about that. Maybe they didn't want to go, maybe they thought it was going to be too much, but actually that anxiety slowly went down as that event went on, and maybe got a little bit easier the next time. If you want some more of those kind of ideas or tips, you can use No Panic, which is a website all devoted to kind of people who are dealing with panic attacks. And Mindshift is a young person friendly app around kind of anxiety, with some more information about it and some more of those kind of strategies and tips that they can try. And it's obviously handy if they just have them on their phone. So these are kind of some of the frequently asked questions we get about this webinar. And if these are questions that you have, there will be a link in the description bringing you to a document that kind of addresses some of these. In terms of additional options of support, if you feel like you or your young person could use something additional, a good place to start is often your GP, who can rule out any kind of underlying physical things, if they're feeling tired all the time or things like that, that sometimes you relate with anxiety or low mood. And also your kind of Senko, or any sort of pastoral lead at school, to kind of get their opinion or see what the school can put in place can be helpful. Your online services. So Cooth is an online wellbeing community for young people, and that is commissioned in Bromley Borough. So they have lots of different kind of resources and information for kids and young people, as well as online counselling chat facilities. Childline also have a really incredible website where you can create an account and find out lots of different strategies, tips and tools, and sort of save them for when you need them, as well as lots of information about different types of difficulty that children might experience. They have young people forums where they can kind of, get advice from each other and realize they're not alone. And also they have counselling via the phone and also web chat and email. Shout is a 24/7 crisis tech service, so this can be used by anyone, and that is for anyone who feels like they're struggling with kind of very negative thoughts or worried about keeping themselves safe. And you just text the word shout to 85258. In terms of your local services, if you feel like kind of self-help or the online options aren't quite right for your young person. So our service, Bromley Y, we're the single point of access for mental health and emotional wellbeing difficulties for young people in the whole borough. So any of those referrals, whether you go to GP or school, will kind of come to us in the first instance. So we can offer direct support to young people as well as parents, but if we're not the right service for you, we will help with an onward referral to the service that we think would be the most appropriate. One of the services that we do send a lot of referrals towards is the Bromley Children Project. They do a lot of great kind of family work and really supporting of parents. At the moment, I think they're running some fantastic regular webinars that you can find out more about on their social media pages. So Bromley Children Project. Some of those webinars are on things like communication, boundaries, tackling the teens. So I really recommend having a look for their webinars as well. And then Talk Together Bromley is the NHS kind of counselling service for adults in Bromley as well. The Signpost is a kind of new offer from us at Bromley Y, and that is our own kind of tech support service for 11 to 18-year-olds. It is open kind of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and it is our practitioners who kind of man that. And that's really just an opportunity for young people who maybe have some questions about mental health, don't really know if they have a problem. They can kind of start a text chat with us. We always get back within 24 hours, and we might be just listening to them. We might be directing them towards some self-help resources or things that they might find helpful, helping them get a different perspective on something. Or if we feel like they would benefit from further support, we would be giving them the information on how to make that referral into our service. So we have more posters about the Signpost that can kind of be downloaded and printed out and given to young people on our social media pages as well. For parents, if you feel like you want to try a bit more self-help, we've just got some additional resources on the screen. So Young Minds is another fantastic website with lots of information for parents, including a confidential advice helpline, which you can do through email or web chat. Helping your child with fears and worries, a self-help guide for parents. We would say that's a bit more for the sort of younger age group, maybe up to about 12 or 13. But if you think that kind of changing some of those behaviours and doing some of the kind of facing fears experiments would be helpful, this is the guide for it. It's done really really simple language, lots of good advice and tips and problem solving and ideas of how to go about that with your young person. Kidscape is a great resource if bullying is an issue for your young person, as well as being able to offer advice. They run workshops for parents and young people around kind of building assertiveness to deal with that bullying. And they also have an advice line if you're struggling with what to do and how best to support a child who's being bullied. And MindEd is just another website that we find really useful and would direct a lot of parents towards around kind of issues of family and mental health and young people. As I kind of mentioned about the Signpost, Bromley Y online, our website has self-help information for parents and for young people, including information on how to make a referral, what might lead you to think the referral will be appropriate, and other kind of resources we'd recommend. We're very active in social media, so kind of Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, where we share these kind of posts that you can see, including kind of tips for both parents and young people, some more kind of information or psychoeducation around things like anxiety, low mood, self-esteem. So it can be a really nice introduction or kind of resource for young people to start thinking about their mental health a little bit more. So we just really want to thank you for kind of watching this webinar with us. We hope you found it helpful and have some tips and strategies to try. We do really value your feedback, so you can scan the QR code that is currently on the screen, which will take you to a very short form, and you can let us know how you found it, what you found helpful, or what might be helpful in any future webinars. As Anne said at the start, we do regularly run our live webinars, and there's a new series that has just started for young people as well. We've got webinars on managing anxiety, managing worry and managing low mood. That'll be running monthly. So just visit our Eventbrite page. So just Bromley Y Eventbrite. If you just search for that, it'll come up and it'll show you our whole list of webinars and our next day. So we hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much.